Have you ever met someone so brilliant, so accomplished, so absolutely certain of themselves that they made you question everything you believed in? Someone who could look you straight in the eye and say, "There is no God," and for a moment, just a moment, you almost believed them? Drive. James Mitchell was that kind of man. And what happened to him 7 minutes after his heart stopped beating will shake you to the core. Because what he saw on the other side was something no medical textbook could ever explain. Something that made one of America's most famous atheists fall to his knees and weep like a child. But before I tell you what he saw in those 7 minutes, you need to understand who James Mitchell really was. Drive. James Mitchell was not your average skeptic. He was not someone who simply doubted or questioned. He was a man who had built his entire identity, his entire career, his entire worldview on one single foundation: that there was no God, no afterlife, no spiritual realm of any kind. And he had the credentials to back it up. Graduated top of his class from MIT at 22. Completed his medical degree at Harvard by 26. By 30, he was already one of the most promising cardiac surgeons in the country. By 40, he was a legend. His hands had held hundreds of human hearts. He had stopped them, restarted them, repaired them, and replaced them. He had looked inside the human chest cavity more times than most people look in a mirror. And every single time, he saw the same thing: tissue, muscle, blood, and valves. Never once did he see a soul. Never once did he find evidence of anything beyond biology. And that, to James Mitchell, was all the proof he needed. His office at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston was a temple to human achievement. Degrees from the finest institutions in the world hung on the walls. Awards and plaques lined every shelf. And right there on his desk, in a simple black frame, sat a quote he had written himself: "I have held the human heart in my hands 1,000 times. It is a pump, nothing more." That quote had become famous. It was the opening line of his best-selling book, The God Delusion of the Heart, which had sold over 2 million copies and had been translated into 37 languages. In that book, James argued with surgical precision that every so-called spiritual experience could be explained by neuroscience. Near-death experiences? Oxygen deprivation causing hallucinations in the temporal lobe. Feelings of divine presence? A spike in dopamine triggered by extreme stress. The sense of peace that people reported after clinical death? Simply the brain shutting down in an orderly fashion, like a computer powering off. He had an answer for everything, and millions of people believed him. James was invited to speak at the world's most prestigious conferences. He debated priests, pastors, rabbis, and imams on national television. And he won every single time. Not because he was cruel or aggressive, but because he was calm, collected, and devastatingly logical. He would smile gently at his opponents and say, "I understand that faith gives you comfort. But comfort is not evidence. And I am a man of evidence." The audiences would applaud. The comment sections would explode. And another Christ follower would go home wondering if maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong all along. But here is the part of the story that will break your heart. At home, behind the closed doors of their beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, there was a woman who loved James Mitchell more than he would ever know. Her name was Rachel. She was his wife of 20 years, his college sweetheart, the mother of his 2 children, and the most patient woman who ever lived. Because Rachel Mitchell was a believer, a quiet, steady, unwavering believer. She did not argue with James. She did not debate him. She did not try to match his intellect or counter his logic. She simply loved him. And she prayed. Every single morning, before the sun came up, Rachel would slip out of bed, walk down to the kitchen, pour herself a cup of coffee, and sit at the table with her Bible open and her eyes closed. And she would pray the same prayer she had been praying for 20 years: "Lord, open his eyes. I don't know how, I don't know when, but you promised that if I am faithful, you will be faithful. So I am asking you, Father, let him see. Let him see what I see." 20 years, 7,300 days. The same prayer, the same faith, the same hope. Most people would have given up. Most people would have accepted that James Mitchell was never going to change. But Rachel was not most people. She had a stubbornness that matched her husband's, only hers was rooted not in pride, but in an unshakable trust that God hears every prayer, even the ones that seemed to go unanswered for decades. And she was right. God had been listening the entire time. He was just waiting for the right moment. A moment that was about to arrive in the most terrifying way imaginable. It was a Sunday morning in October. The kind of crisp, golden New England morning that makes you believe the world was painted by an artist. The leaves outside the Mitchell home were blazing red and orange, and the air smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. Rachel was standing in the bedroom, fastening a pearl earring, dressed for church the way she dressed every Sunday: simple, elegant, hopeful. James was at the bathroom mirror, shaving, already in his hospital scrubs. He had a surgery scheduled for noon, a triple bypass on a 63-year-old retired firefighter. Even on Sundays, the operating room called. Rachel paused in the doorway and looked at her husband. After 20 years, she still loved the way he looked in the morning, still loved the way his brow furrowed in concentration, still loved him, even when he broke her heart. "James," she said softly, "the kids are asking if you're coming to church today. Sarah's singing in the choir." James did not look up from the mirror. "Tell Sarah I'll watch the video later. It's not the same and you know it." He rinsed his razor and set it down. "Rachel, we've had this conversation 1,000 times. And we'll have it 1,000 more if that's what it takes," she said. There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet, unbreakable determination. James turned to face her. He leaned against the bathroom counter and crossed his arms. This was the posture she knew so well. The professor posture. The debate posture. The "I am about to dismantle your argument" posture. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When you pray, who exactly are you talking to?" "Because I've looked at the data. I've studied the brain scans of people in prayer. It's the same neural activity as talking to yourself. The prefrontal cortex lights up, the language centers activate. But there's no signal going out, Rachel. There's no one on the other end of the line. You're leaving a voicemail that nobody is ever going to check." Rachel set her other earring down on the dresser. She walked over to him, close enough that she could see the tiny flecks of gray in his dark eyes, close enough that he could see the tears forming in hers. "James, I'm not going to argue neuroscience with you. You'll win. You always win. But let me tell you what I know. I know that when I sit in that kitchen every morning and I talk to God, something happens inside me. I know that when I'm afraid, He gives me peace. When I'm lost, He gives me direction. When I look at you and I think this man will never believe, something whispers to me, keep praying. And I do. I keep praying. Not because I'm delusional, but because 20 years of answered prayers have taught me that He is real." James looked at her for a long moment, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Something that looked almost like longing. But then it was gone, replaced by the armor he always wore. "Rachel, I love you. I've always loved you. And I respect your faith more than you know. But I cannot believe in something I cannot see, cannot measure, and cannot prove. That is not who I am. I am a scientist. I believe in evidence." Rachel reached up and touched his face. Her hand was warm against his freshly shaved cheek. "Then I'll pray for evidence," she said. And she kissed him and walked out the door. James stood there in the bathroom, staring at the space where she had been. He could still smell her perfume. He could still feel the warmth of her hand on his face. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place he would never admit existed, something ached. It had ached for a long time. Not for God, not for faith, but for the certainty that Rachel had. The peace in her eyes, the calm in her voice, the way she could face anything, absolutely anything, without falling apart. He had seen her bury her mother and still praise God through her tears. He had watched her hold their premature daughter in the NICU and whisper, "God's got you, baby girl," when the monitors were screaming. She had something that no degree from MIT could give him, and he wanted it. He just didn't know how to want it without surrendering everything he had built. So instead, he dried his face, put on his white coat, grabbed his car keys, and headed to the hospital to do the one thing he knew how to do: save lives with his own two hands. He did not know it yet, but this was the last morning he would ever get dressed as an atheist. This was the last argument he and Rachel would ever have about God. Because in exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, James Mitchell's heart was going to stop. And everything he believed, everything he had taught, everything he had written in that best-selling book was about to be shattered into a million pieces by something his brilliant mind could never, ever explain. And Rachel's prayer, the one she had whispered every morning for 20 years, was about to be answered in a way she never could have imagined. Be careful what you pray for. Because when God finally moves, He does not tiptoe. He shakes the earth. The operating room at Massachusetts General Hospital was James Mitchell's cathedral. If he would never admit to worshipping anything, this was the closest he came. The sterile white lights overhead, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the quiet hum of the ventilator, the perfectly organized tray of surgical instruments, each one gleaming like a silver promise. This was where James felt most alive. This was where he felt most in control. And for a man who did not believe in any power greater than himself, control was everything. The patient on the table was Frank DeLuca, 63. A retired Boston firefighter who had spent 30 years running into burning buildings and had the scarred lungs and clogged arteries to prove it. Frank was a big man with a big laugh and a rosary tattoo on his left forearm. Before they put him under, he had grabbed James's hand and said, "Doc, I'm not scared. The man upstairs has got me." James had smiled politely and said, "Mr. DeLuca, I've got you. And my hands don't shake." Frank had laughed. "Fair enough, Doc. But if something goes wrong, it's not your hands I'm counting on. James remembered that comment later. He remembered it for the rest of his life. The surgery began at 12:15. Triple coronary artery bypass graft. James had done this procedure over 800 times. He could practically do it in his sleep. His team moved around him like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Drive. Sarah Chen, his anesthesiologist. Marcus Webb, his surgical assistant. 2 scrub nurses. A perfusionist managing the heart-lung machine. Everything was routine. Everything was textbook. For the first 2 hours, James was in his element. His hands moved with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. His voice was calm and steady as he called out each step. Clamp. Suture. Retract. Good. Next graft. It was beautiful, in its own way. The human heart, laid bare and vulnerable, being repaired by human hands. James believed this was the highest form of human achievement. Not prayer, not faith, skill. At 2:27 in the afternoon, James Mitchell reached for a suture. And then something happened that he had never experienced in 20 years of surgery. A bolt of pain shot through his left arm like someone had driven a railroad spike through it. He gasped. The instrument slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the sterile field. Drive. Chen looked up from her monitors. Drive. Mitchell? Are you okay? James blinked. His vision blurred for a moment, then cleared. I'm fine. Cramp. Give me a second. But it was not a cramp. And deep down, in the part of his brain that had spent 2 decades studying the human heart, he knew it. He knew exactly what was happening. The tightness in his chest. The shooting pain down his left arm. The sudden cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The nausea rising in his throat. He was having a myocardial infarction. A heart attack. The cardiac surgeon was having a cardiac arrest. Right there, in the middle of someone else's open heart surgery. The irony was so cruel it almost felt intentional. Marcus, James said, and his voice sounded strange and far away, like it was coming from the end of a long hallway. Marcus, take over. I need to. He never finished the sentence. His legs buckled. His body crumpled. And drive. James Mitchell, the man who had held hundreds of hearts in his hands, collapsed onto the operating room floor as his own heart seized and stopped. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Marcus Webb shouted for a crash cart. Drive. Chen rushed from behind her monitors and dropped to her knees beside James. A code blue was called overhead, and within 90 seconds, the room was flooded with emergency personnel. They ripped open his scrub top and placed the defibrillator pads on his chest. Drive. Chen started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She pushed hard and fast, the way James himself had taught her years ago. Come on, James, she whispered through grated teeth. Don't you do this. Don't you dare. The defibrillator charged. Clear. His body jerked. The monitor screamed a flatline. Nothing. Again. Clear. Another jolt. Another flatline. Nothing. Meanwhile, in another operating room, a colleague took over Frank DeLuca's surgery. Frank would be fine, but James Mitchell's heart had stopped beating. Completely. Totally. The monitor showed a flat, unbroken line. No electrical activity. No pulse. No heartbeat. By every medical definition in every textbook James had ever read, he was dead. The clock on the operating room wall read 2:28 p.m. when his heart stopped. And for the next 7 minutes and 14 seconds, drive. James Mitchell's body lay motionless on that cold hospital floor while his colleagues fought to bring him back. 7 minutes. 434 seconds. In medical terms, that is an eternity. Brain damage typically begins after 4 minutes without oxygen. After 6 minutes, the chances of survival drop below 10%. After 7 minutes, most doctors stopped trying. But they did not stop. Something kept them going. Something made Marcus Webb refuse to give up. Something made Sarah Chen push harder. Shock him again, and again, and again, even when every monitor said it was over. They did not know it yet, but while they were fighting for his body, something was happening to James Mitchell that would change not just his life, but the lives of thousands. Because while his heart was silent and his brain was starving for oxygen and his body was growing cold on that operating room floor, James Mitchell was more alive than he had ever been. He was somewhere else. Somewhere impossible. Somewhere that, according to everything he had ever believed, did not exist. His 7 minutes had begun. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The first thing James Mitchell noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence you experience in a quiet room, where you can still hear the hum of electricity or the distant sound of traffic. This was absolute silence. Total. Complete. As if sound itself had never been invented. And then he realized something that should have terrified him but somehow did not. He was no longer in pain. The crushing weight on his chest was gone. The fire in his left arm had vanished. He felt nothing. No, that was not right. He felt everything. He felt more alive, more aware, more present than he had ever felt in 45 years of living. It was as if his entire life up to this point had been experienced through a dirty window, and someone had just cleaned the glass. He opened his eyes. Or rather, he became aware that he could see, though he was not sure he had eyes in the traditional sense. And what he saw made his scientific mind reel. He was floating, hovering near the ceiling of operating room 4 at Massachusetts General Hospital, looking down at a scene that made no rational sense. Because down there, on the floor, surrounded by frantic medical personnel, was his own body. He could see himself. His face was gray. His lips were turning blue. Jen was straddling his chest, performing compressions with tears streaming down her face. Marcus was preparing another round of epinephrine. The crash cart was open, its drawers pulled out in desperate haste. And the heart monitor, the instrument he had trusted his entire career, was singing a single, monotonous note, the flatline, the sound of death. James watched this scene with a strange, detached curiosity. He should have been panicking. He should have been screaming. But instead, he felt an overwhelming calm, a peace so deep it seemed to radiate from the very air around him. And the scientist in him, even now, even floating above his own dead body, tried to analyze it. This is a near-death experience, he told himself. This is exactly what I wrote about in Chapter 7 of my book. Oxygen deprivation to the visual cortex is creating a dissociative hallucination. The feeling of peace is a flood of endorphins released by the dying brain. This is textbook. This is neuroscience. This is not real. But even as he thought these words, he knew they were wrong, because he could see things he should not have been able to see. He could read the serial number on the defibrillator from the ceiling. He could see that Marcus's left shoelace was untied. He could see that Chen had a small coffee stain on the back of her scrub cap that she did not know about. He could hear, with perfect clarity, the words Marcus whispered under his breath, "God, if you're real, don't let him die." Not like this. Marcus Webb, his surgical assistant, a man James had never once heard mention God in 15 years of working together. And he was praying. On his knees, with James's blood on his gloves, Marcus Webb was praying. And then the room began to fade. Not suddenly, but gently, like a painting being slowly covered by a soft white cloth. The sounds of the code blue grew distant. The faces of his colleagues blurred. And James became aware of something behind him. No, not behind him. Around him. Above him. Everywhere. A light. But calling it a light was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was luminance beyond anything he had ever experienced or could have ever imagined. It was not white. Exactly. It was every color and no color at once. It pulsed with a warmth that he could feel not on his skin but inside his very being, inside whatever he was now that he was no longer inside his body. The light drew him in. Not with force, but with invitation. Like a mother's voice calling a child home for dinner. Like the smell of bread baking when you have been lost in the cold for hours. It was irresistible not because it overpowered his will, but because every fiber of his existence wanted to move toward it. And so he did. He moved, though he had no legs. He traveled, though there was no ground. And as he moved toward the light, a tunnel formed around him. This was the part he had mocked in 100 lectures. The tunnel, the famous tunnel that every near-death survivor described. He had called it the brain's screensaver in interviews. He had explained it away as the visual cortex shutting down from the periphery inward, creating the illusion of a narrowing tunnel. But this tunnel was not an illusion. It was as real as anything he had ever touched or tasted or held in his surgical hands. The walls of the tunnel were not walls at all but streams of light and memory and music. Yes, music. Not music that he heard with ears, but music that he felt with his entire being. It was as if the universe itself was singing, and the song was so beautiful, so achingly perfect, that James Mitchell, the man who had not cried since he was 11 years old, began to weep. Not tears of sadness, tears of recognition. Because somewhere, in a place deeper than his intellect, deeper than his education, deeper than his pride, he recognized this place. He had always known it. He had been born knowing it. And he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. The tunnel stretched on, and the light it had sent grew brighter and brighter. And James moved faster and faster toward it, and the music grew louder and more complex and more heartbreakingly beautiful. And then, all at once, the tunnel opened, and James Mitchell stepped into eternity. What he saw there would have been impossible to describe in any human language, but he would spend the rest of his life trying, because what he saw in the next few minutes was not a hallucination. It was not a dream. It was not a misfiring of neurons in a dying brain. It was the single most real experience of his entire existence, and it was about to destroy everything he thought he knew and rebuild him from the ground up. James Mitchell had spent his entire career studying the limits of the human body. He knew exactly how many liters of blood a heart could pump in a minute. He knew the precise electrical voltage needed to restart a stopped heart. He knew the chemical composition of tears and the neurological pathway of pain. He had mapped the human body the way a cartographer maps a continent, and he believed, truly believed, that there was nothing left to discover. But when the tunnel opened and he stepped into what lay beyond, James realized that everything he knew was like a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. Nothing could have prepared him for this. The first thing that overwhelmed him was the color. On Earth, the human eye can perceive approximately 10 million colors. James knew this. He had studied the physiology of vision in medical school. But in this place, wherever this place was, there were colors that did not exist on Earth. Colors he had no name for. Colors that seemed alive, that pulsed with emotion and meaning, that spoke to him without words. He saw a shade of blue that communicated perfect peace, a gold that radiated unconditional love, a violet that whispered eternity. And these colors were everywhere, woven into the landscape like threads in an infinite tapestry. The ground beneath him, if it could be called ground, was like crystal, transparent and luminous, as if the earth itself were made of light. And through it, far below, he could see what appeared to be a river. But this was no earthly river. The water, if it was water, was clearer than anything he had ever seen. It sparkled with an inner light, as though each drop contained a tiny star. And it sang. The river sang. A melody so pure, so perfect, that it made every piece of music he had ever heard on Earth sound like static on a broken radio. James walked forward, and with each step, the beauty intensified. Meadows stretched out before him, covered in grass that was greener than green, alive and swaying not with wind but with joy. Trees rose around him, their trunks silver and their leaves golden, and from their branches came a fragrance that was not any single flower but all flowers at once, every beautiful scent that had ever existed on Earth combined into one perfect aroma. And the air was not just something he breathed. The air was alive. It carried warmth and welcome and an overwhelming sense of home, as if every place he had ever lived, every house he had ever loved, every moment he had ever felt safe and complete had been distilled into the very atmosphere of this place. But all of this, the colors, the crystal ground, the singing river, the living meadows, all of it faded into the background when he saw what was ahead of him. Because there, at the end of a vast, open plain of light, was a throne. Not a throne made of gold or jewels, though those elements were present. This throne was made of glory itself. Pure, undiluted, blazing glory that radiated outward in waves so powerful that each wave knocked James to his knees. Not in pain, but in awe. In recognition. In the sudden, crushing, annihilating realization that he was in the presence of something so immeasurably greater than himself that all his degrees, all his publications, all his awards, all his intellect were less than nothing. And then he saw him, standing before the throne, bathed in a light that was both blinding and somehow perfectly visible, was a figure. And James knew, instantly and absolutely, who it was. Not because of any religious painting he had seen, not because of any description he had read. He knew because every cell in his being, every particle of his existence, resonated with the truth of it. This was Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, the one whose existence James had denied for 25 years, the one whose followers James had mocked on television, the one whose name James had used as nothing more than a casual expletive. He was real. He was here, and he was looking directly at James with eyes that held more love than the entire universe could contain. James fell to his knees, not voluntarily. His body, or whatever form he had in this place, simply could not remain standing in the presence of such holiness, such power, such overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful love. And for the first time in his adult life, drive. James Mitchell, MIT graduate, Harvard professor, best-selling author, famous atheist, had absolutely nothing to say. No argument, no theory, no clever rebuttal, no scientific explanation. Every word he had ever spoken against God turned to ash in his mouth. Every page of his best-selling book burned away like paper in a furnace. Every debate he had ever won revealed itself for what it truly was, a man arguing with the ocean about whether water was wet. And then Jesus spoke, not with sound waves that traveled through air and vibrated eardrums. He spoke in a way that James felt in every part of his being, as if the words were being written directly onto his soul. James. That was all. Just his name. One word. But in that one word was contained everything. Every moment of James's life. Every thought he had ever had. Every tear he had never cried. Every prayer Rachel had ever whispered over her morning coffee. It was all there, held in the sound of his own name spoken by the voice of God. And James, the man who never cried, the man who prided himself on his emotional control, broke completely. He wept. He wept the way a lost child weeps when he finally sees his mother's face in a crowd. He wept for the years he had wasted, for the lies he had told, for the people he had led away from this very place with his words and his books and his brilliant, devastating arguments. "I'm sorry," James whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know you were real." And Jesus looked at him with those eyes, those impossible, infinite eyes, and James felt something wash over him that was not judgment, not condemnation, not anger, but grace. Pure, undeserved, relentless grace. The kind of grace that does not wait for you to be worthy. The kind that finds you at your worst and loves you anyway. And in that moment, James Mitchell understood for the first time what Rachel had known all along. That faith is not the absence of evidence. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. And some things are so real, so true, so overwhelmingly present that no microscope or telescope or brain scan could ever capture them. They can only be known by standing in their presence and letting them break you open. What happened next was something James would later describe as the most painful and the most healing experience of his entire existence. Jesus did not speak again with words. Instead, he simply looked at James, and James understood that he was about to see something. Not something in the future. Something in the past. His past. Every moment of it. And then it began. It was not like watching a movie. It was not like remembering a memory. It was like reliving every single moment of his life, but with one devastating difference this time. He could feel what other people felt. Every interaction, every conversation, every glance, every word he had ever spoken, he now experienced from the other person's perspective. And it nearly destroyed him. He saw himself at 28, a young resident at a teaching hospital, brilliant and arrogant and so sure of himself. A patient, an elderly woman named Margaret, was dying of congestive heart failure. Her daughter had asked James if there was any hope. And James, in his clinical, matter-of-fact way, had said, "Her heart is failing. There is nothing more we can do. I suggest you make arrangements." He had delivered this news the way he might read a lab report. Efficiently, accurately, without a single drop of compassion. And now, standing before the throne of God, James felt what Margaret's daughter had felt in that moment. The floor dropping out from under her world. The cold terror of losing her mother. The desperate need for someone, anyone, to say something kind, something human, something hopeful. And how James had given her nothing. Just data. Just facts. Just the cold, surgical truth without a shred of mercy. He felt her cry in the hospital parking lot. He felt her hands shake as she called her brother. He felt the emptiness in her chest that lasted for months. And James gasped with the weight of it. Because he had never known. He had walked away from that conversation and moved on to his next patient without a second thought. But the pain he had caused had lived on in that woman for years. And that was just one moment. There were thousands. He saw himself as a father, missing his daughter. Sarah's first choir performance because he was at a conference in Geneva, presenting a paper on atheistic humanism. He felt Sarah's eyes scanning the audience, looking for his face, finding his empty seat, and the way her voice wavered on the next note because her daddy wasn't there. He felt the hot tears she blinked back because she didn't want her choir director to see. He felt the lie she told her friends afterward: "My dad had an emergency surgery." He really wanted to be here. She was 9 years old, and she was already making excuses for him. And James felt every ounce of that little girl's disappointment, and it cut deeper than any scalpel he had ever held. He saw himself with Rachel, 100 different mornings, dismissing her faith with a wave of his hand, a roll of his eyes, a condescending smile. He felt what she felt every time he did that. The small, sharp sting of being belittled by the person you love most. The loneliness of believing in something beautiful and having your partner treat it like a disease. The quiet courage it took to kneel in prayer every morning in a house where prayer was considered foolishness. He felt Rachel's tears, the ones she cried in the shower so he wouldn't hear. The nights she lay awake beside him, loving him and hurting at the same time, praying, always praying, that God would open his eyes. But the worst part, the part that brought James to absolute devastation, was seeing the impact of his book. His best-selling, award-winning, critically acclaimed book. He saw a college student in Ohio named Daniel, 19 years old, raised in a Christian home, struggling with doubt the way all young people do. Daniel's roommate gave him a copy of The God Delusion of the Heart. James felt Daniel read it. Felt the way each chapter chipped away at the foundation his parents had built. Felt the night Daniel closed the book, set it on his nightstand, and whispered to the ceiling, "I guess there's nobody up there after all." He felt the emptiness that followed. The drinking that started a month later. The depression that crept in like fog. The phone call Daniel's mother received 2 years later from a hospital in Columbus. James saw face after face after face. Hundreds of people who had read his book and walked away from faith. A grandmother in Texas who had stopped going to church. A recovering addict in Detroit who had thrown away his sobriety coin because James's book convinced him that the higher power he leaned on was imaginary. A teenage girl in California who had been the light of her youth group until she read an excerpt online and decided it was all a lie. James felt their emptiness, their confusion, their loss, and he understood, with a horror that transcended anything he had ever experienced, that he had not simply written a book. He had torn the wings off butterflies. He had stolen light from people who were already struggling in the dark. He had used his God-given intellect to lead God's children away from their Father. And through it all, Jesus stood there, not angry, not condemning, just present, just loving. And somehow, that made it worse. Because anger, James could have handled. Punishment, he could have understood. But this relentless, unwavering love in the face of everything he had done was more than his soul could bear. He fell forward onto the crystal ground and pressed his face against it and wept until he thought he would dissolve. "How can you love me?" he cried. "After everything I've done, after everyone I've hurt, how can you possibly love me?" And in that moment, without words, Jesus answered. Not with a speech or a sermon or a theological argument. He answered by showing James the cross. Not the sanitized, polished cross that hangs in churches. The real cross. The blood. The nails. The torn flesh. The weight of every sin ever committed by every human who ever lived, pressing down on the shoulders of one innocent man. And James felt it. He felt the nails. He felt the thorns. He felt the suffocation. And he understood, finally, completely, irreversibly, that this was the evidence he had been asking for his entire life. Not evidence that could be measured in a laboratory, but evidence that was written in blood and proven by love. The kind of evidence that does not argue. It simply is. And it is enough. After the life review ended, James did not know how long he remained on the crystal ground. Time did not seem to work the same way in this place. Seconds could have been hours. Hours could have been seconds. All he knew was that at some point, the overwhelming weight of grief and regret and revelation began to lift, replaced by something new. Something he had never felt before in his entire life. Forgiveness. Not just the idea of forgiveness. Not a theological concept or a philosophical principle. Actual, tangible, experiential forgiveness that flowed through him like warm water through frozen pipes, thawing every cold and hardened place inside him, reaching into corners of his soul he didn't even know existed. He lifted his face from the ground and looked up. Jesus was still there, still radiant, still present. And now, there was something new in those infinite eyes. A question. James could feel it forming before it was spoken, the way you can feel rain coming before the first drop falls. And then it came. Not in English. Not in any human language. It came in the language of the soul. A communication so direct and so pure that there was no possibility of misunderstanding. James, you have seen what is real. You have felt what is true. Now I give you a choice. You may stay here, in this place, where there is no more pain, no more doubt, no more death. Or you may go back. Which do you choose? James looked around him. He looked at the meadows that sang, the river that sparkled with living light, the sky that was not a sky but an endless declaration of glory. He breathed in the air that tasted like joy. And every part of him, every fiber, every particle, every atom of his being screamed, stay. Stay here. Never leave. Why would anyone leave this place? Why would anyone choose to go back to a world of suffering and sickness and death, when they could remain in the presence of this indescribable beauty forever? It would be so easy, so peaceful, so perfectly, eternally right. But then he saw her face. Rachel's face. Not the way she looked when she was dressed for church or laughing at dinner or standing in the doorway with her pearl earrings. He saw her the way she looked at 5 a.m., alone in the kitchen, with her coffee and her Bible, whispering his name to God. He saw the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 20 years ago. Lines that came from years of praying for a man who called her prayers foolish. He saw her hands, folded so tightly that her knuckles were white, pressing her faith into the wood of the kitchen table as if she could push it through the floor and down into the foundations of the earth. He saw the tear that always fell exactly halfway through her prayer, the one she always wiped away before she said amen. The one she thought no one ever saw. But God saw it. God caught every single one. And he kept them. The Bible says that God stores our tears in a bottle, and James now understood that this was not a metaphor. Somewhere in this infinite place, there was a vessel filled with 20 years of Rachel's tears, and every single drop was precious, and every single drop had been heard. And then he saw his children. Sarah, 17, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, singing in the choir every Sunday, looking at his empty seat, and still singing, still believing, still hoping that one day her father would be there. And Thomas, 14, quiet and thoughtful, who had started asking questions about God at school, and then stopped, because he was afraid of disappointing his father. Thomas, who had a Bible hidden under his mattress like contraband, who read it at night with a flashlight like a prisoner reading a secret message from outside the walls. James's own son, afraid to believe because his father had made belief something to be ashamed of. The weight of it crashed over James like a wave. He had spent his life saving other people's hearts while his own family's hearts were breaking. He had traveled the world debating the existence of God while his wife sat alone at the kitchen table, begging God to save her husband's soul. He had written books about the delusion of faith while his teenage son hid his faith like a guilty secret. And now, standing at the threshold of paradise, James Mitchell finally understood what really mattered. Not being right, not being brilliant, not winning arguments. What mattered was the woman in the kitchen, the girl in the choir, the boy with the flashlight. "Send me back," James said. And even as the words left him, he felt the loss of it, the beauty he was giving up, the peace he was choosing to leave behind. But the decision was not difficult. It was the clearest, most certain decision he had ever made. Clearer than choosing MIT, clearer than choosing surgery, clearer than anything. "Send me back. My wife has been praying for 20 years. She deserves to see her prayer answered. My children deserve a father who will kneel beside them, not stand over them. And all those people, all those faces I saw in the life review, the ones I led away from you, I have to find them. I have to tell them the truth. I have to undo what I've done. Please, send me back." Jesus looked at him, and in that look, James saw something that he would carry with him for the rest of his earthly life. He saw pride. Not human pride, not arrogance, but the kind of pride a father feels when his lost son finally turns around and starts walking home. The kind of pride that has been waiting, patiently, lovingly, for years and years and years, and is now rewarded not with perfection but with surrender. And that, James understood, was all God had ever wanted from him. Not his intellect, not his achievements, not his arguments, just his surrender, just his willingness to say, "I was wrong. You are real, and I'm coming home." Then Jesus spoke one final time, and the words he spoke were not for James alone. They were for every person who has ever doubted, every person who has ever wrestled with faith, every person who has ever lain awake at night wondering if anyone is listening when they pray. "Tell them," Jesus said. "Tell them I am real. Tell them I am here. Tell them I have never stopped loving them. Not for 1 second. Not even when they stopped loving me." And then the light began to fade. The meadows, the river, the throne, the colors that had no earthly name, all of it began to dissolve, not into darkness, but into a kind of gentle dimming, like the last light of sunset before the stars appear. And James felt himself falling, not downward but backward, through the tunnel, through the light, through the space between eternity and time, back toward the cold operating room floor and the sound of Drive Chen's desperate compressions and the screaming flat line on the monitor. He was going back to his body, back to his life, back to Rachel. And for the first time in 25 years, he was not going back as a skeptic. He was going back as a witness. The clock on the wall of operating room 4 read 2:35 p.m. and 14 seconds when Drive James Mitchell's heart started beating again. 7 minutes and 14 seconds of clinical death. 434 seconds of flatline. By every medical standard, every statistical model, every piece of clinical data that James himself had spent his career studying, he should have been dead. Not just dead but brain dead. Not just brain dead but gone. 7 minutes without oxygen to the brain. The damage should have been catastrophic and irreversible. There should have been nothing left to save. But there he was. One moment, the monitor was singing its terrible monotone song of death. The next moment, without any additional shock from the defibrillator, without any additional medication, without any medical intervention at all, James Mitchell's heart began to beat. Not weakly, not irregularly. It began to beat with a strong, steady, perfect rhythm, as if it had never stopped. As if someone had simply reached down and restarted it with a touch. Drive. Sarah Chen, who had been performing chest compressions for over 6 minutes and whose arms were shaking with exhaustion and grief, felt it before she saw it. A pulse, strong and unmistakable beneath her palms. She looked up at the monitor in disbelief. The flat line was gone. In its place was a heartbeat. A beautiful, rhythmic, impossibly normal heartbeat. 72 beats per minute. Textbook perfect. "Oh my God," she whispered. And then louder, to the room, "We have a pulse. We have a pulse." Marcus Webb, who had been standing by with the epinephrine, dropped the syringe. His hands were shaking. The two scrub nurses grabbed each other. Someone was crying. Someone was laughing. The room, which moments before had been a scene of desperate tragedy, erupted into stunned, disbelieving joy. But the celebration was cut short by what happened next. James opened his eyes. Not gradually, the way patients usually emerge from unconsciousness, with fluttering eyelids and confused murmurs. His eyes snapped open all at once, wide and clear and blazing with an intensity that made everyone in the room take a step back. These were not the eyes of a man who had just been revived from clinical death. These were the eyes of a man who had seen something enormous, something that had rearranged every molecule of his being. He looked up at the faces surrounding him. Drive Chen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Marcus, pale and trembling. The nurses, the emergency team, they were all staring at him as if they were looking at a ghost. And in a sense, they were. Because the man lying on that operating room floor was not the same man who had collapsed 7 minutes ago. That man was gone, erased, overwritten. In his place was someone new. Someone who had stood before the throne of God and been broken and rebuilt in the space between heartbeats. James's lips moved. At first, no sound came out. His throat was dry. His body was weak. But the words inside him were burning with a fire that would not be contained. He reached up and grabbed the front of Drive Chen's scrubs with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man who had been dead 7 minutes ago. She leaned in close. James? Can you hear me? Don't try to move. You've had a cardiac event. We need to Rachel, he said. His voice was hoarse and cracked, barely above a whisper. But the word filled the room like a thunderclap. Call Rachel. Tell her she was right. About everything. Tell her it's all real. All of it. Everything she's been praying for. It's real. Sarah Chen blinked. She looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her. Neither of them knew what to say. This was not a normal post-resuscitation response. Patients who came back from clinical death were usually confused, disoriented, often combative. They did not wake up lucid. They did not wake up with messages. They did not wake up with tears of joy streaming down their faces and a light in their eyes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the fluorescent bulbs overhead. James, Sarah said carefully, you need to rest. You've been through. I was dead, James said, and now his voice was stronger, clearer, carrying an authority that silenced the room. I was dead, and I went somewhere. And I saw him. I saw Jesus Christ. He is real. Sarah, he is as real as you are. More real. Everything I taught, everything I wrote, everything I said on those stages and in those debates, I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. The room was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady, miraculous beeping of James Mitchell's heart monitor, counting out the beats of a heart that should not have been beating. A heart that had been dead and was now alive. A heart that had been cold and was now on fire. They transferred him to the cardiac ICU. Within the hour, he was stable. Within 2 hours, his blood work came back, and the attending cardiologist, Drive Robert Kim, stood at the foot of his bed with a look on his face that James recognized. It was the look of a scientist confronting data that did not fit the model. Drive Mitchell, Kim said slowly, your troponin levels indicate a massive myocardial infarction. You should have significant cardiac damage. But your echocardiogram shows. He paused. He looked at the chart again, as if reading it for the third time might change what it said. Your echocardiogram shows a perfectly healthy heart. No damage, no scarring, no evidence of infarction. I've never seen anything like this. James looked at him and smiled. It was not the old smile, the confident, slightly condescending smile of the famous atheist surgeon. It was a new smile. The smile of a man who had been given a second chance and knew exactly what he was going to do with it. I have an explanation for you, Drive Kim, James said. But I don't think you're going to find it in any medical journal. Meanwhile, Rachel Mitchell was in the church parking lot when her phone rang. She had just finished the service. Sarah's choir performance had been beautiful. Rachel had recorded it on her phone to show James later, the way she always did, the way she had done 100 times, always hoping that the next time, he would be there in person. She saw the hospital number on her caller ID and felt the first cold fingers of fear grip her chest. She answered. She listened. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered on the asphalt. And then Rachel Mitchell, who had prayed for 20 years without ceasing, who had whispered her husband's name to God over 7,000 cups of morning coffee, who had never once stopped believing that this day would come, fell to her knees in that church parking lot and did the only thing she knew how to do. She lifted her hands to the sky and she praised God with a voice that echoed off the stained glass windows and rose straight up into the October sky. Because her prayer had been answered. Not the way she expected, not on her timeline, but answered nonetheless. Completely, totally, miraculously. And 20 years of faithfulness were vindicated in a single phone call from a hospital in Boston, where her husband lay in a bed with a new heart and a new soul and tears on his face and the name of Jesus on his lips. The first thing James Mitchell did when he was released from the hospital, before he went home, before he ate a meal, before he changed out of his hospital gown, was call his publisher. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after his heart had stopped and restarted, and his editor, a sharp, efficient woman named Patricia Holloway, was thrilled to hear from him. His second book was due in 4 months, a follow-up to the bestseller, tentatively titled Beyond the Delusion: Why Science Will Always Triumph Over Faith. It was already generating buzz. Pre-orders were strong. The publisher had booked a 30-city speaking tour. Patricia, James said. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made her stop typing mid-email. I need you to cancel the book. Silence on the other end. Then I'm sorry, what? Cancel the book. Pull it from production. Cancel the speaking tour. Cancel everything. James, You can't be serious. We have contracts. We have commitments. There are financial. I'll pay whatever penalties are required. But that book will not be published. Not now. Not ever." Patricia's voice dropped to a careful, measured tone. "The tone you use with someone who might be having a breakdown." "James, you've been through a traumatic medical event. This isn't the time to make major decisions. Let's wait until." "Patricia, I have never been more clear-headed in my life. That book is a lie. My first book was a lie. Everything I've been saying for 25 years is a lie. And I will not publish another word that leads people away from God." "This conversation is over." He hung up. And then he called Harvard Medical School and resigned his professorship. The dean tried to talk him out of it. His colleagues tried to talk him out of it. Everyone tried to talk him out of it. The medical community was stunned. The academic world was baffled. Social media exploded with speculation. James Mitchell, one of the world's most prominent atheist intellectuals, had disappeared from public life overnight. The rumors ranged from brain damage caused by oxygen deprivation to a complete psychotic break. His atheist followers were furious. His debate opponents were suspicious. The media was circling like sharks. But James was not paying attention to any of it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Rachel, in the same chair where she had prayed for him every morning for 20 years. And he was telling her everything, every detail: the tunnel, the colors, the river, the throne room, Jesus, the life review, the question, the choice. He spoke for 3 hours without stopping, and Rachel listened without interrupting. And the coffee in their cups went cold, and the afternoon light shifted from gold to amber to rose. And when he was finally done, Rachel reached across the table and took both of his hands in hers and said the words she had been waiting 2 decades to say: "Welcome home, James." That evening, he sat down with Sarah and Thomas. Sarah, who was 17 and had her mother's quiet strength. Thomas, who was 14 and had his father's searching mind. He told them what had happened. Not the clinical version. Not the scientific version. The real version. And when he got to the part about seeing Sarah's empty seat in Heaven's Life Review, about feeling her disappointment at every missed choir performance, his voice broke and he could not continue. Sarah crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her father and held him the way she used to hold him when she was little, and she said, "It's okay, Dad. I always knew you'd come around eventually. Mom told me." She said God was working on you. She said to be patient. And Thomas, quiet, careful Thomas, reached under the couch cushion where he was sitting and pulled out a worn, dog-eared Bible. It was the one he had been hiding under his mattress. He held it up and said, "Dad, I've been reading this for 2 years. I was afraid to tell you." James took the Bible from his son's hands and held it against his chest and closed his eyes. And in that moment, he made a vow. He would never again be the reason his children were afraid to believe. Over the next 6 months, James wrote a new book. He wrote it at the kitchen table, in Rachel's chair, with her Bible open beside his laptop. He wrote it in the mornings when the house was quiet and the coffee was hot and the first light of dawn was coming through the window. He called it The Surgeon Who Saw Heaven, a doctor's journey from atheism to faith. He wrote about the science he had studied and the faith he had denied. He wrote about the operating room and the tunnel and the throne room and the life review. He wrote about Rachel's prayers and Sarah's choir and Thomas's hidden Bible. He wrote about the look in Jesus's eyes, a look that contained more data, more evidence, more proof than every laboratory on earth combined. And he wrote about grace, the kind of grace that does not wait for you to deserve it, the kind that finds the most hardened heart in the most sterile room and cracks it wide open with nothing but love. He did not write it for fame. He did not write it for money. He wrote it as an act of repentance. Every page was a prayer. Every chapter was an apology to every person his first book had damaged. And when it was finished, when the last word was typed and the last page was printed, James sat back in his chair and wept, not because of what he had lost, his career, his reputation, his standing in the intellectual world, but because of what he had gained. A faith so real he could taste it. A family that was finally whole. A purpose that was worth more than every award he had ever received. The book was published quietly, by a small Christian publishing house in Nashville. There was no 30-city tour, no television appearances, no debates, just a simple book with a simple cover, a stethoscope laid across an open Bible. And within 3 months, it had sold 1 million copies. Not because of marketing or celebrity endorsements or controversy. Because the truth, when it is spoken by someone who has nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose, has a power that no marketing budget can match. People read it and they wept. They read it and they returned to churches they had left years ago. They read it and they fell on their knees in living rooms and kitchens and parked cars and whispered the same words James had whispered on the crystal floor of heaven. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know you were real." James applied for and received a position as the chaplain at Massachusetts General Hospital, The same hospital where he had performed over 1,000 surgeries, the same operating room where he had died and come back to life. His former colleagues thought he was insane. Some of them refused to speak to him. Others sought him out in quiet moments, in empty hallways and deserted break rooms, and asked him the question he saw in their eyes. "James, is it really true? Is there really something more?" And every time, he gave the same answer. "More than you can imagine. More than I could ever put into words. But I will spend the rest of my life trying." 2 years had passed since Drive. James Mitchell's heart stopped beating on the floor of operating room 4. 2 years since 7 minutes and 14 seconds changed everything. 2 years since a broken man opened his eyes and spoke the name of Jesus for the first time, not as a curse but as a confession. And in those 2 years, something extraordinary had happened. Something that James himself could never have planned or predicted or engineered. Something that could only be described by a word he once despised: a miracle. It started small, the way all great movements of God start small. A nurse at Mass General read his book and rededicated her life to Christ. She started a prayer group in the hospital cafeteria that met every Tuesday at 6 a.m. 4 people came the first week, 12 the second. Within 6 months, there were over 100 hospital staff members gathering before their shifts to pray for their patients, for each other, and for the kind of faith that could survive a 12-hour shift in the ICU without breaking. The hospital administration did not know what to make of it. Patient satisfaction scores went up. Staff turnover went down. Something was changing in the culture of that hospital, and it had nothing to do with new policies or management strategies. It had everything to do with a surgeon who had seen the other side and come back with a fire that would not go out. Then the letters started coming. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands. From every state in America and from countries James had never visited. People who had read his first book, The Atheist Book, and had walked away from God because of it. People who were now reading his second book and walking back. A retired teacher in Minnesota who had stopped going to church 15 years ago after reading The God Delusion of the Heart. She wrote, "Drive. Mitchell, your first book took God from me. Your second book gave him back. I'm 73 years old and I was baptized last Sunday for the first time since I was a child. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth." A college student in Georgia who had been on the verge of taking his own life. He had read James's new book in a hospital waiting room while his mother was in surgery. "I was sitting there thinking that nothing mattered, that there was no point, that when we die there's nothing. And then I picked up your book from the table and I started reading and I couldn't stop." Drive. Mitchell, you saved my life. Not with surgery. With your story. I know now that there's something waiting for us. I know now that I matter. I'm getting help. I'm going to be okay. A prison inmate in Texas who had been an atheist his entire life. "I killed a man when I was 22. I've been in here for 18 years. I never believed in God because if God was real, how could he let someone like me exist? Then your book came through the prison library. I read it in one night, and I understood. God didn't make me a killer, but he can make me something new. I got on my knees in my cell last night for the first time in my life. I don't know if he heard me, but I think he did. I think he's been waiting for me." James read every letter, every single one. He kept them in boxes in his study, organized by date, and some nights after Rachel and the kids were asleep, he would sit in there and read them by lamplight and weep. Not tears of sadness anymore. Tears of wonder. Tears of a man who was watching God use his worst mistakes as the raw material for something beautiful. Because that is what grace does. It does not waste anything. Not your failures. Not your sins. Not even the years you spent fighting against the very God who was fighting for you. It was at a conference in Dallas, 18 months after his book was published, that the moment happened. The moment that James would later call the full circle. He was speaking to an audience of 3,000 people in a convention center ballroom. The crowd was a mix of believers, seekers, and skeptics. James stood at the podium in a simple navy suit, no white coat, no stethoscope, no surgical mask, just a man with a story and a microphone. He had just finished telling the audience about the life review, about seeing the faces of people his first book had damaged, when he said the words. He always said at this point in his testimony, "If you are here tonight, and you were one of those people, if my words or my book led you away from God, I want you to know that I am sorry. From the deepest place in my heart, I am sorry. And I want you to know that it's not too late. It's never too late. Because the God I met in those 7 minutes is a God who does not give up on anyone. He didn't give up on me. And he hasn't given up on you." The room was silent. 3,000 people holding their breath. And then, from the middle of the auditorium, a woman stood up. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair and red-rimmed eyes, and she was trembling. James stopped speaking and looked at her. Their eyes met across the vast room. "Drive. Mitchell," she said, and her voice carried through the silence with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. "My name is Anna. 5 years ago, I was a youth group leader at my church. I loved God with everything I had. Then I read your book, your first book, and I lost my faith. I left the church. I left my community. I told my students that I had been wrong, that God wasn't real, and some of them believed me. Some of them left too." She was crying now, tears running freely down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I've been carrying that guilt for 5 years. Drive, Mitchell. The guilt of leading those kids away. The guilt of giving up on the one thing that ever gave my life meaning. And then someone gave me your new book, and I read it. And I knew it was true. Because I felt it. The same way I felt it when I was 19 years old and I gave my life to Jesus for the first time. I felt him. He was right there. He had never left." She took a shaky breath and then said the words that shattered James Mitchell's composure and brought 3,000 people to their feet. "Drive, Mitchell. I came here tonight to tell you something. Last month, I went back to my old church. I stood in front of the congregation and I told them what happened. I told them I was wrong to leave. And I asked for their forgiveness. And do you know what they did? They didn't judge me. They didn't condemn me. They opened their arms and they welcomed me home. Just like the father in the prodigal son story. Just like Jesus welcomed you in those 7 minutes. And drive, Mitchell, 3 of those kids I led away? They were in the congregation that day. They came back too. They came back because I came back. Because you came back. Because God never stops calling his children home." James could not speak. The great orator, the man who had debated the finest minds in the world, stood at the podium with tears streaming down his face and no words in his mouth. He did not need words. The room did not need words. 3,000 people were on their feet, not applauding, just standing, many of them crying, many of them raising their hands, many of them closing their eyes and feeling, for the first time or the 100th time, the presence of a God who is real and who is relentless in his love. Later that night, after the conference, James drove back to his hotel in silence. Rachel was beside him, her hand on his knee, her eyes still glistening. The Dallas skyline glittered in the rearview mirror, and James thought about something Jesus had shown him during those 7 minutes, a truth he had not fully understood until now. God does not need our perfection. He does not need our intellect or our achievements or our flawless track record. He needs our surrender. He needs our willingness to say, "I was broken, and you put me back together. And now I'll spend the rest of my life telling people that you can do the same for them." That is the ripple effect of grace. One heart touches another, which touches another, which touches another, spreading outward in circles that have no end. A wife prays for 20 years. A husband dies for 7 minutes. A book is written. A woman stands up in a crowded room. 3 kids come back to church. And somewhere, in a place beyond time and space, where the river sings and the colors have no name, Jesus smiles. Because another lost child has come home. If you are watching this right now, and you are that lost child, if you have wandered away from God, or never known him at all, if you have been hurt by religion or confused by science, or simply tired of pretending that the emptiness inside you is not there, I want you to hear what James Mitchell heard on the crystal floor of heaven. You are loved, not because of what you have done but in spite of it. Not because you are worthy but because he is gracious. And it is not too late. It is never too late. The same God who restarted James Mitchell's heart in that operating room is ready to restart yours right now. All you have to do is ask. Close your eyes, take a breath, and say the words that changed everything. God, if you're real, show me. I'm ready to see. He is real. He is here. And he has been waiting for you.